So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're tuning in from. Welcome to today's live webinar of a topic that is definitely important and timely in today's rapidly evolving business landscape and evolution of AI. My name is Aileen, and I'm part of the team here at Viso Trust. I'm excited to introduce our speaker for today, Paul Valente, who is the CEO and co-founder of Viso Trust. And just wanted to note that we love an engaging audience in our webinars, so feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, tell us where you're tuning in from, and maybe pose a current question, challenge, or curiosity you have around AI and security. And before we dive into the discussion, just a housekeeping note, we will give you the opportunity to ask questions at the end of the webinar. We usually save the last 5 to 10 minutes. So please use the chat box or the Q&A box to submit your questions, and we'll do our best to address them at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, let's get started. I am excited to hand it over the virtual stage to Paul Valente, who will guide us through today's webinar. So Paul, you can take it away.
Thank you, Aileen. And good day, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be here and have the chance to speak to you today. And welcome to Secure the Supply Chain, Effective Third-Party Risk Management for the Modern Enterprise. I'm Paul Valente, CEO and co-founder of Viso Trust. Viso Trust, for those of you that don't know, is a SaaS company which automates TPRM and digital trust using generative AI. We've been established since 2020 and are in use by some of the largest and most mature companies in the world for automating third-party cyber risk management. Prior to founding Viso Trust, I was a career chief information security officer and spent decades on both sides of third-party cyber risk management. I spent many years in a financial services context. I was CISO of Lending Club, also of Restoration Hardware, also ASAP in the technology and AI space. And whether I was in technology or highly regulated industries like financial services, I was deeply involved in third-party cyber risk management ever since the late 90s. I was involved with organizations such as BITS and Shared Assessments. In my career, I was a CISSP, a CISM, etc. And again, spent decades on both sides of third-party cyber risk management. In fact, have been involved with the third-party cyber risk management programs of over 250 of the Fortune 1000. So I'm delighted to have the chance to present to you today. Our topic today focuses on best practices, specifically in third-party cyber risk management for the modern enterprise. Jumping right into it, let's focus a little bit on why is third-party cyber risk management important, right? Over the past 20 years, this has been a transforming space that has emerged really as a result of what the Gartners and the Forresters and other analysts refer to as digital transformation. Companies leverage third parties to do business today in a very, very strategic and pervasive way. Whereas, a decade ago, a company may have leveraged perhaps a handful of, let's say, marketing service providers for digital marketing. Today, there are thousands of such providers, and a typical company may use 20, 50, 100, 200 of these companies, right? And the same goes with regard to every type of digital service, right? So today, many companies are approaching 100% of their technology footprint being owned by third parties. That, of course, brings risk. Whenever you share sensitive data or access, your attack surface increases exponentially. That has resulted rather intuitively in third-party breach emerging as the single largest cause of breach, with 60, some say 65, or as high as 75% of third-party breaches the result of the failure of third parties to make good on their security commitments. There is also increased regulatory scrutiny, increased oversight with regard to compliance and our ability to look at and evaluate and manage the risk of our third parties. Today, most regulatory frameworks, most compliance frameworks all have some focus on third-party risk, and this is increasing with organizations like the SEC, the OCC, et cetera, ratcheting up with regard to oversight on third-party cyber risk management. But let's take a step back for a moment and think about ourselves, our teams as security practitioners, as perhaps TPRM practitioners, and really think about how we use third parties and what our mission is. Is it just to make sure that we don't have a breach? Uh, and I would suggest that it's not just that, right? Companies need the products and services of third parties to innovate and to stay relevant in today's market, right? CIOs, CTOs, a big part of their responsibility is delivering new technologies, new innovations, new approaches to their constituents, to their companies, to support revenue initiatives, to support cost savings initiatives. And our role as, let's say, TPRM practitioners or CISOs is to enable that, to allow companies to onboard better solutions faster with less risk, not just to prevent breaches, right? So I think it's important to emphasize that, and it's a critical part of what comes with being a modern enterprise, right? Moving along, what is effective third-party cyber risk management, right? As opposed to just trying to catch risk where you can or trying to prevent breaches. First of all, it's achieving and maintaining a comprehensive view of third-party risk. What that means is that your security team either has it at its fingertips or has a high degree of awareness of the landscape of third parties of which your company is dealing, right? In fact, if to the degree that if there is an issue in the news about a particular organization, you can immediately know, is this organization a third party of yours? If it is, what sort of access do they have to your environment? What sort of data have you shared with them? Which business units within your organization are interacting with them? And have you assessed them recently, right? What is the state of that relationship? And that information in today's world, you probably need that for your fourth parties and maybe even beyond, right? For many companies, this is a huge challenge. We'll get more into that in later slides here. But achieving and maintaining a comprehensive view of your third-party landscape is, of course, critical. Secondly, reducing your organization's adoption of new third-party risks, right? We can think of this as, okay, maybe, regardless of existing vendors, let's make sure that we don't unconsciously adopt new risk. So are we involved in the procurement of new technologies, of new vendors, of new services? And are we engaged in such a way where we can affect the amount of risk that the organization brings on while doing that? So reducing the organization's adoption of new risk from third parties. Next, connecting with that ongoing landscape of third parties, the next responsibility here in effective TPRM is reducing the existing risks from incumbent third parties, right? So there's some certain number of third parties that you're already doing business with, perhaps you haven't for a long time. And what are we doing to lower that risk? What are we doing to manage that risk, right? For most companies, this is where there's perhaps a significant unknown, right? We'll get into why there's those unknowns and what to do about that in a moment. But the last responsibility, which is something that's often forgotten, especially when folks are designing TPRM processes according to, let's say, shared assessments, CTPRP, or according to a myriad of other frameworks that tell you, how you should assess third parties. What they often ignore is the impact on the business. And the impact on the business actually does change your ability to affect risk outcomes. It also affects your ability to have a security culture. It will ultimately even affect the tenure of the security team, right? Really the success of your entire program. If you don't take the business's needs into account, if you don't understand business risk as well as security, compliance, privacy, resiliency, et cetera, all these myriad of third-party risks that we're concerned about and trained to be concerned about, you ultimately will not be successful at mitigating any of those risks if you don't have the business risk in mind. So the last requirement then becomes reducing risk without slowing down the business's ability to achieve its core business function and initiatives, right? And this gets into a whole myriad of things about SLAs, about being a great business partner, about being easy to work with, about giving highly standardized, highly actionable, easy to understand results that are defensible, that can't be undermined by various arguments from various individuals or within your organization, or inconsistencies within your own process that can be pointed out by your constituents. So where do we go wrong at large? Where have we gone wrong at large industry? So many of you, listening to those prior, issues on the slide before, thinking about what's effective, are probably thinking about, okay, Paul's in dreamland here. This is far away from what we can do. We're dealing with so many third parties, right? These processes are very, very difficult. Business owners don't care; they're not interested, right? This is way more. It's all easier said than done, right? In terms of what Paul's talking about here. Why is that? Why is that? Let's jump into that a little bit and see what the industry has provided for us. So, essentially, third-party cyber risk management started off again in really the late 90s from a technology standpoint, when companies started to use what we then called application service providers, right? That's now turned into SaaS providers, and there's cloud providers and IaaS providers and PaaS providers and a variety of different options out there that are rather all encompassing of the products and services that you may need to operate as a business. But there's been a few pervasive approaches in third-party cyber risk management. The first one that I'm sure you're all aware of is questionnaires. Now, there's 1,000,001 different products out there that you can get to allow you to put a questionnaire online, or you can send one in a spreadsheet, which many companies still do. And what's the problem with these? Well, there's quite a few problems with these. One, they're operationally intensive and labor intensive for both sides, for the vendor and the client organization, right? So there's a limit to how many you can send. There's a limit to how many you can analyze. Many companies receiving them will not answer them today, depending on their size, depending on the clout dynamics within the relationship. You can end up with huge gaps in your visibility, as well as you may not be able to assess the number of vendors that you need to as quickly enough as you may need to, right? So again, slow, labor intensive. But there's another even bigger problem. And those of you out there in the audience that have been on both sides of this problem, meaning that you've been on the vendor side and on the client side, will immediately recognize this problem. The problem exists with any sort of a survey mechanism, especially one where folks are highly invested in the outcome, which of course in this interaction they would be. And that issue is bias, right? Vendors filling out security questionnaires or compliance questionnaires are highly biased to deliver positive results or positive answers on those. There's also significantly a large gap with regard to awareness, ability, and qualifications with regard to the people tasked with filling them out, right? They're often sales professionals, perhaps business development reps, or not necessarily really at the heart of the security organization, because many organizations cannot really afford to put their highest security talent on answering questionnaires, which is of course time consuming. So that leaves us, when we do get filled questionnaires, what we call a false sense of security, right? They are filled with essentially false negatives, right? Areas where the reporter has reported that there are not gaps, but there are. So questionnaires, this process is flawed. I think everybody knows that, right? The second thing, the kind of innovation understanding that questionnaires have problems with their data and with the amount of labor and really the scalability of the process. All of this, you'll see it's either data quality or scalability, pervasive as problems within this space. The second thing that kind of came out as another approach was the security ratings. This is companies like those listed here, like BitSight, Security Scorecard, etc. And there's actually dozens of these, right? Now, they have also some critical flaws that have led them to be no substitute for due diligence, no substitute for an inside out view of a company's security posture. What are those limitations? The limitations is that they rely on publicly available attribution and discovery information. They can discover a company's domain and then they can discover the infrastructure related to that domain. But what does that lead to us from a technical standpoint? It leads us to corporate marketing websites. Those of us that have had experience in IT management understand that those are typically isolated from corporate infrastructure. They're also isolated from production infrastructure. So they're therefore no real indication of a company's security posture or maturity or level of awareness or investment in security. They can be convenient, but unfortunately, again, no substitute for due diligence. So we're kind of back at square one with those. Next, the next approach that has been offered to us historically is the exchange model. Ever since the late 90s, folks got the idea of, wow, it's so much work to assess a company. I wish we could just do this once and then share these. Hence, BITS, Shared Assessments, Cloud Security Alliance, VSA, etc. A myriad of organizations have tried to tackle this from the commercial side, companies like CyberGRX, etc., with the exchange model. Write once, read many is the idea. However, what we have found is that vendors do not want to share the most sensitive information or undergo an assessment when and provide information to companies that they have not met, right? Companies want to be interacting in perhaps a sales context before they share that information. As a result, exchanges have universally had low adoption, which means that if you sign up for one, you're typically going to get 10, 15% of your vendors covered that way. For the rest, the other 80% or 85% of your vendors, you're stuck building another process. You're back to questionnaires or ratings, right? So ultimately, not the ROI that one would hope. They're also point in time. They also are not bespoke to your particular use case, right? Which you're under different regulations than a different customer. You're handling different data. You may be using different products and services, right? So again, just not solving the problem. So here's where the industry has really failed us, and we're stuck with kind of arcane approaches, right? So where do most companies go wrong in designing their programs? Not just with regard to those approaches, right? So this first bullet point I'll skip. I think we talked plenty about the problems with approaches with questionnaires, ratings, and exchanges. The next issue, where companies often address less than 20% of the risk overall in their TPRM program, is with regard to inherent risk and defining criticality. As a great example, I was recently in conversation with a productivity tool software provider, a very large company. I would estimate that more than 60% of you use their tools. And when the conversation originally started with them, we were in a discussion about critical vendors and what they assess currently. Now, as you can imagine, they're a company with thousands of employees, and they also actually have thousands of vendors, as many companies of that size do. Now, how many vendors were they assessing for residual risk on an annual basis? Typically, one might expect that they might be, if they've got 1,000 vendors, maybe 20% of those they're sharing sensitive data with. That's a typical benchmark, that we see across the industry. And those are the ones you'd want to assess. Well, in this particular case, they were assessing between 10 and 20 vendors a year. Why was that, right? Well, when they originally set up their program, they were very concerned about compliance posture, about essentially defensibility from an audit standpoint. And they were also, like all of us, resource constrained, right? There is only so many vendor relationships that they could assess, and given the manual process that they had built. And so they scoped criticality based specifically on business operational criticality, right? Do we need this company to keep the lights on, deliver services to our customers moment to moment, day to day, right? Now, as you can imagine, not every company that they share sensitive data with meets that criteria. As a result, they were reviewing a very small vendor footprint, and therefore much risk, specifically data breach risk, was left unaddressed. This is a common problem that we see across 75% programs, is a definition of either inherent risk criteria or business criticality that's driving third-party cyber risk management, and therefore leading to you looking at too small of a population, right? So not assessing all relationships for inherent risk is the first kind of source of kind of risky decision or risky problem that we see. Now, the next one is not assessing high risk vendors, meaning high risk from an inherent risk standpoint, for residual risk in a standardized way using actionable data, right? So this is where we fall into, okay, I'm assessing using questionnaires, and the questionnaires are coming back positive. So I'm therefore getting a false sense of security, right? Companies are typically missing a very substantial amount of risk by essentially the false negatives that they're getting in questionnaires. The same goes for security ratings. If you check, you'll see that across security ratings, some of the companies that are the largest and most secure and most often have poor security ratings based on information that that is actually incorrect. I've spent a lot of time assessing myself with these technologies, using these technologies, and so it can go both ways. You can get the most common reason for issues is misattribution, unfortunately. So the kind of the most important issues tend to be false positives, and of course, since there's no depth, then any positive result is likely a false negative. So quality data in a way that is really actionable to reduce risk, right? And before I go on to that next bullet point, what is action? What is meaningful action? Meaningful action is one of three things. It is selecting a different vendor, right? It is reconfiguring the relationship, meaning working with the vendor in a different way that limits the risk, right? Maybe I'm not going to share this data that I originally was going to share. Maybe we're going to implement their on-prem or our cloud solution rather than their SaaS platform because their security program isn't up to snuff. Or the last one, which is remediation. Remediation requires certain cloud dynamics between the relationship, the client and the business provider, but is also a key way. So those are the three ways that you can essentially affect individual relationships. And that brings us to our next point, which is you can only affect these relationships if you're effectively failing vendors in your process. You're finding issues, right? And those issues are using standardized information that's actionable and defensible and accurate, right? And then really importantly that many companies miss is you need to do so early enough in the procurement cycle to actually give you the ability to have those three choices. The best case is all the way up front at the selection phase, right? At the RFP phase, assessing companies for security there, alerting your business stakeholders of what the requirements are, what's important, and allowing them to make better decisions based on the outcome of your security assessments. Now, for many companies, their processes are too difficult, and in relation, their teams are too small, which we'll get into, what we do about that when we get into best practices in a moment. But typically, they're stuck with just finalists. Some companies even only after the contract is signed, right? So the later you address this, the fewer options you have. Obviously, you can't do anything after the contract's signed except for wait for renewal and perhaps renegotiate. and the earlier you are, the more of those choices you have available in moving the needle on risk. So that's our last place where companies go wrong: not consistently failing vendors, or doing so early enough in the procurement cycle to affect risk. So how can you do this differently, right? How can you solve these operational problems? How can you solve these visibility problems? How can you solve these data quality issues, right? And what are the best practices in doing so for modern organizations? The first one, we're going to kind of backtrack, start at square one here. Some of this might be review for some of you, but there's a really wide variety of folks in the audience, and so I want to make sure that folks get the benefit here. But the first thing is knowing your environment, knowing the expectations. It's really easy to walk into an environment and take your training from CTPRP or from CISSP or whatever organization you're involved with and say, this is how we have to do it, right? And many companies take that approach, and a year later, they say, okay, we love our approach, but we've only assessed 10% of our vendors, right? So obviously it's not working, or we're creating a lot of frustration. So the first thing is understanding your requirements very succinctly. So that's know your environment, know the people, process, technology of your organization, understand its business requirements, understand the data environment, and of course the regulatory environment. Perhaps and understand, in addition to the risk, why else you need third-party cyber risk management, right? The risk is of course of critical importance in today's climate, but you may need to report to certain folks, right? Maybe there are third parties that are pushing you to run your program in a certain way. Maybe there's regulatory organizations, right? Or maybe it's based on the type of data that you handle. So that's the first thing. Understand your environment, understand the expectations. The next one is understanding your third-party landscape. How do you get this, right? Of course, you're going to get some of this from getting the understanding of people, process, and technology, but you can get very focused by getting lists from procurement, getting lists from IT, getting lists from finance, right? That's kind of where to start if you're completely new in creating a process and discovering the third-party landscape, right? The next important best practice that I've seen companies go wrong with over and over is focusing on risk rather than focusing on a process to check a box, right? If you set up your program properly to look at inherent risk of all third parties in a way that is highly automated and gives you the understanding that you need to, based on data, based on business context, based on access, you're going to get the coverage that you need to across your entire population, and you're going to optimize by only having to do residual risk on those vendors where you understand that there was a high or critical or a significant inherent risk, right? So that's the first critical optimization: to one, give you visibility, and two, to make sure that you're focusing your effort where it matters most. The next is, again, to focus on risk at both stages in the process, at the beginning and at the end. It's all about risk here, not about checking boxes, right? Next, take advantage of recent developments in technology to understand risk at scale and to automate. Most companies today don't have the resources to assess the tens, hundreds, thousands, in some cases tens of thousands. They're small teams of 1, 2, 5, 10 people are tasked with on TPRM, right? So you will need to take advantage of automation. Today, what we've found with the VisoTrust platform is the ability to, using our unique patented technology that we call artifact intelligence, using the latest cutting edge techniques in generative AI, particularly retrieval augmented generation, which is part of artifact intelligence, patented in in 2017, successful at some of the largest companies, including tier one banks across the country, affords us the ability today to translate information directly from artifacts that third parties already have into whatever format, whatever structure necessary, and to instantly provide risk assessments. Now, you and yourself and your AI journey and your company's AI journey, of which all companies today, I think, pretty much are embarking on in one shape or form, in some cases, whether they like it or not, some kicking and streaming. In any case, there are abilities with technology that were not available, a very short time ago. And it's important to take advantage of these. And there's a huge opportunity to do so, and a huge opportunity in your third-party cyber risk management to enable your business stakeholders to do so as well and support the innovation that you need to within your organization to stay competitive. So anyway, I encourage folks to invest in automation, and you're going to have a build or buy, a decision in front of you. The next, utilize a practical approach that delivers accurate results. Now, what gives us more accurate results than questionnaires? What gives us more accurate results than ratings? The answer is artifacts. Every one of you out there that has built a security program or come into a program that perhaps needs revitalization as a CISO understands that a thriving program produces artifacts. First, let's think about when you create a program. When you create a program, when you're the first security hire, after you've done a little surveying, you've done a little bit of learning, you're going to start building a policy. Then you're going to start building standards and procedures, and then you're going to have other business units start to turn these into processes and technologies. You're going to procure technologies, right? Later, as you get more mature, you're going to involve third parties. Also, if you come into a new program where you're going to revitalize, what do you typically do? You hire your favorite pen testing company to go get you a baseline that produces a report. You hire a third party to come in and assess your GRC program, give you an idea where the gaps are, right? These are what you do internally. These all produce artifacts, right? Your vulnerability management program produces artifacts. Your various programs that you have all produce artifacts, right? It's possible today using, for instance, VisoTrust Artifact Intelligence to nearly instantly assess vendors, any vendor, based on artifacts of the security program that already exists in a highly automated way, right? And this provides way more accurate results because you have the concept of assurance at your disposal, right? Is this just a claim? Is this a questionnaire response, right? That's, a low level of assurance, right? Has this been validated by a qualified third party, and is it described comprehensively, and does it follow a known framework, etc., right? We're climbing in assurance level, right? As well as within the context of a third party audit, was it done by interview? Was it done by observation? Was it done by analysis? What was the period of the analysis? What was the population of the analysis? These sorts of things all infer different levels of assurance, right? And when you focus on artifacts rather than questionnaires, you're able to take assurance into account and take into account also things like your business context, the data that's in scope for the relationship, right? And these have to balance. More sensitive data, higher level of assurance required, right? Again, focus on artifacts to deliver accurate results for your program that are actually actionable. Do so based on standards so that they are defensible among your constituents and consistent across your team. This kind of brings us straight into our last point, which is be a great business partner to ensure adoption of your process and actually moving the needle on risk, right? If you aren't a great business partner, then your process could be bypassed, right? Perhaps you're at a company where you can still force yourself in with various gates. Perhaps they can't get a check signed unless they had a security review. great. But if you're not a great business partner, it's going to be a problem, right? If you're injecting business risk by delivering results at the 11th hour just before the contract is signed, right, when really the ship has already sailed, dragging people before the risk committee, that is going to result in essentially apathy with regard to security. It's going to hurt your security culture. It's going to be very stressful for your team. Ultimately, it's issues like this that lead companies to decide that their CISO or the security leadership is not aligned with the objectives of the business and contributes to the 18 to 24 month average tenure that we see for security leadership. So be a great business partner, ensure adoption, deliver results early in the procurement cycle so that they can integrate those results into their selection process so you can really move the needle on risk, and help companies, help your internal customers to onboard better solutions faster at the speed of business. That concludes what we prepare for you today. I'd love to, with Aileen's help, I'd love to take a look at some questions that you folks may have brought.
Great job. Thank you so much, Paul. We did have a couple of questions come in, so I'm just going to read them off. We'll start with the latest question we got in the chat. How do you defend the challenge that assurance does not equate to a technical audit?
Defend the challenge that assurance does not equate to a technical audit. So first, I think you should look at technical audits as well, right? I think that's the first thing. There really isn't a substitute for a technical audit. Now, that being said, every type of audit can be gamed. It can be gamed by your third party. It can be gamed by your internal constituents, right? And CISOs in the audience would agree that with every type of assessment, no matter what, somebody just handing you, one of your own staff handing you a vulnerability scan, there are assumptions, right? Is this everything that's in scope, right? That is always a question. And so far, even for pen testers, what's the IP ranges that we can look at? Obviously, external. There's some different constraints there, like responsible disclosure program, for instance. But in any case, there's always this consideration. But that being said, you should look at application security review output. You should look at pen tests, right? You should look at technical reviews. Now, not all companies will make these available to you. And sometimes you'll have to rely on the processes that substantiate the fact that they do these things and they use third parties to do these things. And so you won't always be able to get this, but obviously that's technical. You should get those technical evaluations and assessments, whenever you can. Next, to get more to the heart of your question, so when determining assurance based on, let's say, a third-party audited artifact, let's say a SOC report or an ISO or a BSI report or a C5, or there's a myriad, right? PCI reports, of which our platform supports, all of these and many, many more. There's actually a huge range of, let's say, a SOC 2 type 2 among the SOC reports, of a good one and a great one, or a bad one and a great one, right? There's actually a huge range. And so it's important to understand that and determine the level of assurance in a granular way, right? Now, this requires automation, it requires sophistication, it requires expertise, it requires understanding the difference between analysis, between observation, between interview audit techniques, right? And understanding the different level of assurance of those. It takes understanding what the optional points of focus are within, let's say, a SOC 2 engagement and how many of them have been included. It includes an understanding of the diversity and the presence of key controls within that SOC report, right? It involves analysis of the actual controls and actual control language, right? So I think the important thing there is not to assume and to look at these things. And this is probably the motivation for the question. You definitely should get away from, oh, yep, they've got a SOC 2, check, right? Because that's not enough, right? There are good SOC 2s and bad ones. Hopefully that answers your question. It's a great question. And we've actually thought about, I was just thinking about, whether to do a webinar specifically on that, because we could definitely spend an hour in depth on what the difference is between a great third-party audit and a bad one. And so feel free to, chime in there if you think that's something you'd like to see from us. Our platform has looked at, tens of thousands of every type of these artifacts. We definitely have more sophistication in analyzing these than any company in the world. So we'd be delighted to share some of those best practices with you, should that be of interest. So thanks for that question. Next question, Aileen.
Thank you, Paul. Next question, how do you balance or approach what you can use AI for and what tasks should stay with your security team?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is kind of the question for everybody looking at AI-based solutions everywhere today, right? There's so much more that you can do now, but what can the humans do? And what do the humans still need to do, right? I think as you get closer to implementing, having worked at several companies that took AI as a very kind of core approach, so at Lending Club around credit decisioning and things like that, and then at ASAP automating call center operations and various security tasks, and then Viso, of course, and working in this space actually since 2016, developing AI techniques and models for automated interpretation of security related language. I'm very, very close to this issue, but as soon as you start solving the problem, you're going to see where there's limitations, right? And you're going to see where you still need a human. Maybe you need a human for supervised machine learning, to continuously train your models. Maybe you need a human in the loop approach where certain things have eyes on them by a qualified individual. And that's been the approach at Viso. Actually, we believe in providing assessments of third parties that are not only standards based and efficient, but they also have to be accurate. They have to be something you and your team can completely stand behind. In fact, they have to be better than our best customer would be on their own, right? They have to be the most accurate that there is out there based on the information provided, right? And so we use a human, in the loop, right, to ensure that there's accuracy. We also use humans to train our models and annotate. So I think most things today, you're still gonna need a human. And as you've seen, like with things like ChatGPT and Bard and these consumer facing, or well, they're also business too, but is that they have to have a lot of disclaimers, right? If your business is such that you can't have a lot of disclaimers, you're going to have a human in there, right? So it's more, we're at the stage today, most things can't be completely automated away. Just people can become much more efficient by leveraging newest developments in AI. So great question. And I think it's something also to keenly look at with your third parties. Our platform covers AI trust as well, which obviously is a fairly new field for most companies, right? We've got the NIST framework, we've got the OWASP framework. Neither of those are highly mature, right? There's no certification for AI trust. Companies that we assess for AI trust, it's something that many of them are looking at it for the first time, when they get assessed by us. So it's something you're going to look at with your third parties. How do you specifically make sure that what you give me is accurate, right? So I encourage you to ask that. You're going to have to ask that question that you asked me to kind of everybody out there. And our platform is a great way to do so. But anyway, next question, Aileen.
Yeah, I think that sort of weaves into the next question. How do you navigate customers that are anti-AI when your business is trying to innovate with AI?
Yeah. So you address that with strong policies, practices, standards that you can be highly transparent about. You also address that with contract terms that protect what they're concerned about, right? And you may ask, what are they concerned about, right? They're concerned about privacy of the information of their employees and customers, right? They're concerned about intellectual property of their own, that may be shared with you by their employees, right? They are concerned about data integrity, right? As just like the prior question, right? Or the integrity of services delivered with AI. And then other things that are really common, that are really an application of same things that we've always done in security, right? Which is like, is there going to be information leaks? Can there be injection to expose training data or the information of others, right? The equivalent of the same sort of attacks that we've seen in application security, but specifically applied to this new kind of AI paradigm. And so you really have to get assurance in the same way you always did. The major shortcoming I would say today is a lack of audits out there that cover this very well. Most companies are going to have to be pushed, which we're at the forefront of doing, to include AI trust in, let's say, their next SOC 2 Type 2 or their next ISO or their next whatever their primary third-party audit is. Usually they are not in there today. So we're relying on other parts of other types of information. But yes, it's buyer beware. Read the terms, understand the terms, protect your information, and evaluate services closely. Great question.
Thanks, Paul. Looks like we have time for about 2 more questions. How do we implement effective continuous monitoring without adding significant operational overhead on both the business and its vendors and partners?
Yeah, that's great. That's great. So there's a few different aspects to doing continuous monitoring effectively, and these are really going to differ depending on the resources of your team. And the way this question was worded kind of loads that up for me already, right? Certain types of monitoring, I would say most of the open source intelligence sort of monitoring is kind of, from a team standpoint, a resourcing standpoint, has to be seen today, unfortunately, as a nice to have, because it's only teams where you have enough people that you can do a lot of tinkering, right? Because you're going to be looking at lots of false positives and false negatives. You're rarely going to find something useful, right? You're going to be looking at a lot of noise. The approach that we have taken on our platform really reflects my opinion on this subject, which is that there are certain things that maybe you can afford them and maybe you can't, but there's some things that you have to be able to do. And those things are, you have to know when a company that could impact you, if there's a disclosure of a breach or somebody has reported something that could turn into a breach, perhaps in the news, you need to know about that. And if that impacts not only your third parties or your fourth or nth parties, you need to know about that. At the very least, you need to know about that because the CEO is going to run into your CISO, or your CISO is going to be at a board meeting, and somebody's going to ask them about that because they saw that in the news, and they're going to need to know, do we use this vendor? Does one of our vendors use this vendor? Do we have anything to do with this? Are we impacted by this? The same thing goes for high profile security incidents like Log4j or Struts or any of those types of things, right? Great example of the first category is obviously like MoveIt, something like that. So you need to have monitoring in place that gives you that telemetry. And so rather than kind of go the OSINT route and appeal to kind of folks that have a lot of team members that can kind of sift through data, we've focused on those high signal things in our platform. So public risk notice monitors your third parties for with regard to incidents and breach notifications. It also monitors various public sources for high profile security incidents and publishes advisories, puts you in a position to get the information that you need to know, and to focus your limited resources where they can do the most. I think the next thing is in terms of continuous monitoring, which is not always marketed as continuous monitoring, but if you can automate the management and remediation of your vendors, like for instance, if you're asking your vendors, hey, in 3 months you need to get MFA everywhere, and in 6 months, you need to add encryption to your SOC report or whatever that is, being in the position to completely automate that interaction and that management of the third party, and to continuously check with them when it's time for them to have a new pen test, when it's not time for them to have a new PCI report, automatically collect those, automatically analyze those, just notify you of critical changes and risk that may happen as a result of, let's say, new pen test findings or whatnot, is super important. So these are the approaches that we've taken that allow folks running TPRM and specifically third-party security to dealing with tens, hundreds, thousands of third parties to be able to continuously monitor them, right? It's monitoring artifacts, it's managing remediation, it's monitoring the public sphere, giving you the information you need to know, telling you which end parties you may be connected to. So that's a great question, and something I think that we're going to see change a lot, over the next few years. Companies moving away from this kind of high noise, low signal to kind of like all signal, because we're dealing with so many third parties and we're sharing data in so many places. We really need to focus on what's most important. Great
Absolutely.
question.
And final question, how do you assess the AI capabilities of vendors? Everyone now claims AI and machine learning capabilities, but a risk assessment of a hidden algorithm is not possible.
Yeah. Yeah. There's lots of work being done in terms of pushing for standards, pushing for organizations to be more transparent, for transparency in AI and understandability, right? Understandable AI. But those things are admittedly at their infancy, right? And so we look at controls in these areas, and our platform, obviously takes that very seriously. But I think this question was broader than let's say just security and privacy and technology risk. I think this is about let's say procuring technologies and making sure that they're good, and that proclaim AI-based capabilities. I would say you still really have to test. You really have to get your experts in there. You have to do POCs. You've got to poke holes. You got to do things on your own and compare with the results that you got. And that's, as an AI company, that's something that Viso has taken very seriously, right? Our platform has always, onboarded, allows companies to go from kind of zero to hero in TPRM and in 4 minutes. But a couple of weeks ago, we added free AI-based assessment of third parties, right? So you can go to our website, register on the platform, and kick off an assessment of a third party. You can also interact with artifact intelligence and assess your own artifacts, right? And see that in action. So this is important for folks to have that transparency, right? To see really results in action. And I would say you're going to have to do that with every AI touting technology out there, which I guess kind of everything today is, probably has some angle, but you are going to have to test. You are going to have to question and learn as much as you can about their techniques and what's under the hood. I think a lot of what you see today, of course, there's companies like Viso, which have been, patented technology since 2017, and there's companies that, oh, ChatGPT is hot. People are talking about generative AI. We got to plug something in and, do something, right? We need a copilot. We need a chatbot. So that's an important thing to look at. What's the history of this company? What's the reputation of this company? Where else are they deployed in my industry, etc. So kind of some buyer beware type of stuff there for sure. Great question. One that many folks, I'm sure it resonates with many folks on the call. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Paul. And I think that wraps up for today. Thank you everyone for attending and sticking around for the questions. We have ongoing AI security webinars through the end of the year. So we will definitely keep you up to date on our next AI webinar on October 30th. And that's it. Everyone have a great day. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.